The winter night of December 7th, 1943, 20,000 feet beneath the surface coordinates that marked the Truk Lagoon approach, Lieutenant Commander Samuel Dealey stood in the conning tower of USS Harder, a Gato-class submarine, watching through the periscope as a Japanese convoy materialized from the darkness. The air inside smelled of diesel fuel, unwashed bodies, and the metallic tang of recycled oxygen. 6 merchant ships, fat with cargo, escorted by 2 destroyers. His executive officer whispered the range, 4,000 yards. Dealey didn't respond immediately. He was calculating, not with the frantic energy of desperation, but with the methodical patience of a fisherman who knows the current will bring the catch to him. The Harder's diesel engines were silent now, running on battery power at 3 knots. By German standards, by the metrics that Kriegsmarine officers used to judge submarine effectiveness in their Berliner staff meetings, the Harder was pathetically slow. A German Type 7 U-boat could manage 17 knots on the surface, nearly 8 submerged. The Gato-class boats, these American workhorses, could barely reach 9 knots underwater on a good day. And yet, in 3 years, boats like the Harder would account for over 1,300 Japanese vessels sent to the bottom of the Pacific, crippling an empire's ability to feed itself, fuel its war machine, and transport the raw materials that had justified the entire war in the first place. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The question that haunted German naval intelligence throughout 1943 and 1944 was brutally simple. How were these slow, ungainly American submarines achieving what the vaunted U-boat fleet, despite its technological superiority and accumulated expertise from the Battle of the Atlantic, could not replicate in their own waters? The answer lay not in speed, but in a fundamental misunderstanding of what submarine warfare in the Pacific would actually require. The Germans had designed their submarines for the Atlantic, a theatre where convoys moved in predictable patterns between Britain and North America, where the distance between hunter and prey was measured in hundreds of miles, where speed meant the difference between intercepting a convoy and watching it slip past. The Americans, inheriting none of this experience and burdened with what Berlin considered obsolete design philosophy, had accidentally built the perfect weapon for an entirely different kind of war. In the spring of 1938, when the initial design specifications for what would become the Gato-class were circulated through the Bureau of Ships in Washington, German naval observers in the United States paid little attention. The plans called for a fleet submarine with a surface displacement of 1,500 tons, a length of 311 feet, and a maximum surface speed of 20¼ knots. These numbers meant nothing revolutionary. The range specification, however, was extraordinary, 11,000 nautical miles at 10 knots. This was not a submarine built for the patrol patterns of the North Sea or even the broader Atlantic. This was a vessel designed to operate in an ocean so vast that the distance from Pearl Harbor to Tokyo measured over 4,000 miles, where forward bases might not exist, where a submarine might spend 60 days at sea without touching land. The German design philosophy, refined through 2 decades of theoretical planning between the wars, emphasized speed and diving depth. The Type 7C, the workhorse of the Kriegsmarine submarine fleet, could dive to 220 meters and could sprint at 17 knots on the surface. This made it deadly in the confined waters of the Atlantic approaches, where convoys could be spotted, tracked, and attacked in coordinated Wolfpack operations that had nearly brought Britain to its knees in 1942. But the Pacific was not the Atlantic. The convoy routes from the Dutch East Indies to Japan, from Singapore to Tokyo, from the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia to the home islands, stretched across thousands of miles of open ocean. Japanese merchant vessels, poorly escorted and often sailing alone, followed predictable routes dictated by geography, monsoon patterns, and the location of fuel depots. An American submarine didn't need to chase a target at high speed. It needed to reach the hunting grounds, remain on station for weeks, and wait for the targets to come to it. The Gato-class, with its enormous range and relatively comfortable crew accommodations, was built precisely for this kind of patient, enduring warfare. The Germans never quite grasped this distinction. In the winter of 1942, Kapitän zur See Harro von Hesburg, a German naval liaison officer stationed in Tokyo, sent a detailed report back to Berlin after inspecting captured American submarine equipment from the USS Perch, which had been scuttled by its crew in the Java Sea. His assessment was withering. The torpedo fire control system, he noted, was overly complex and prone to mechanical failure. The diesel engines were underpowered compared to German standards. Most damningly, he wrote that the surface speed of 20 knots was, quote, insufficient for modern submarine operations as demonstrated in the Atlantic Theatre. He recommended that the Japanese should not waste resources attempting to replicate American submarine technology, as it represented obsolete thinking rooted in Great War concepts rather than modern naval doctrine. Von Hesburg's report was filed, copied, and circulated among Kriegsmarine staff officers. It confirmed what they already believed, that German submarine design represented the pinnacle of underwater warfare technology, and that American efforts in this domain were, at best, competent imitations lacking true innovation. This judgment seemed reasonable in early 1942. German U-boats had sunk over 6 million tons of Allied shipping in 1942 alone. The United States Submarine Force, operating primarily out of Pearl Harbor, Fremantle, and Brisbane, had managed to sink only 180 Japanese ships in its first year of war, totaling roughly 600,000 tons. The numbers appeared to vindicate German confidence, but these early American failures had nothing to do with submarine design and everything to do with a catastrophic technical problem that would take 18 months to fully resolve. The Mark 14 torpedo was fundamentally defective. The Mark 14 torpedo, issued to every American submarine at the start of the war, suffered from 3 separate, critical failures. Its magnetic exploder, designed to detonate beneath a ship's keel and break its back, triggered prematurely or not at all. Its contact exploder, the backup detonation system, was too fragile and often shattered on impact without exploding. And the torpedo ran approximately 10 feet deeper than its set depth, passing harmlessly beneath shallow draft vessels. American submarine commanders, men like Dealey, Dudley Morton, Richard O'Kane, and Eugene Fluckey, spent the first year of the war firing torpedoes at perfect targets and watching them fail. They filed report after report, describing textbook attacks that resulted in 0 sinks, but the Bureau of Ordnance in Washington, staffed by officers who had designed the weapon and staked their careers on its success, refused to believe that the torpedo itself was flawed. They blamed submarine commanders for poor shooting, for faulty attack procedures, for cowardice in the face of enemy counterattack. The psychological toll was devastating. Officers who had trained for years, who had executed perfect approaches and fired at stationary targets from ideal positions, watched Japanese ships steam away undamaged while depth charges rained down in retaliation. Some commanders suffered nervous breakdowns. Others were relieved of command, their careers destroyed by a weapon that didn't work. It wasn't until the summer of 1943, after submarine commanders in the Pacific literally conducted their own unauthorized field tests by firing torpedoes at cliffs and examining the wreckage, that the Bureau of Ordnance finally acknowledged the problems. The magnetic exploder was deactivated, the contact exploder was redesigned, the depth settings were corrected, and suddenly, almost overnight, American submarines became the most lethal anti-shipping force in naval history. In 1943, American submarines sank 335 Japanese vessels, totaling over 1.5 million tons. In 1944, that number climbed to 600 ships and nearly 3 million tons. By 1945, there were almost no Japanese merchant ships left to sink. The Japanese merchant marine, which had begun the war with approximately 6 million tons of shipping, was effectively annihilated. Over 60% of all Japanese merchant vessels that went to war never came home. The majority of those losses, roughly 70%, were attributed to American submarines. The Gato-class boats, those slow, obsolete designs that German officers had dismissed, were responsible for the bulk of this destruction. Of the 288 submarines the United States operated during World War II, the Gato-class and its immediate successor, the near-identical Balao class, represented over 150 boats. They were not individually exceptional. No single technological breakthrough made them superior. What made them devastating was their fitness for purpose, their reliability, and the operational doctrine that employed them. Consider the profile of a typical Gato-class war patrol in 1944. The submarine would depart from Pearl Harbor, Midway, or an advanced base like Saipan, carrying 24 Mark 14 torpedoes, provisions for 75 days, and a crew of 80 officers and men. It would transit to its assigned patrol area, often in the waters off the Japanese home islands, the Philippines, or along the convoy routes between Southeast Asia and Japan. This transit alone might take 2 weeks, covering thousands of miles. Once on station, the submarine would patrol on the surface at night, using its radar to detect targets at ranges up to 10 miles, far beyond visual range. During daylight hours, it would submerge and either rest on the bottom or patrol slowly at periscope depth, conserving battery power. When a target was detected, the approach would begin. Unlike the Wolfpack tactics of the Atlantic, where multiple submarines would converge on a convoy in coordinated attacks, American submarines in the Pacific often operated alone. The commander would close to firing range, typically between 800 and 1,500 yards, and fire a spread of torpedoes, usually 4 to 6, calculated to hit the target even if the ship maneuvered. After firing, the submarine would dive deep, rig for silent running, and endure the inevitable counterattack from escort vessels. Depth charges would detonate, each one a hammer blow of overpressure that could crack welds, shatter gauges, and rupture hull fittings. The crew would remain absolutely silent, breathing shallowly, listening to the propellers of the destroyers hunting them overhead. Sometimes the counterattack would last hours. Sometimes the attackers would give up after 30 minutes, either running low on depth charges or losing contact. When it was over, the submarine would creep away, surface after nightfall, recharge its batteries, and continue the patrol. This was not the glamorous, high-speed warfare that German submarine doctrine envisioned. It was patient, grinding, and psychologically exhausting. The conditions inside a submerged Gato-class submarine were barely tolerable. The temperature often exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit, with humidity approaching 100%. Condensation dripped constantly from the overhead pipes. The smell of diesel fuel permeated everything. Fresh food ran out within 2 weeks, and the crew subsisted on canned goods and dehydrated rations. There were no showers, no privacy, and no respite from the constant noise of machinery and the ocean. Men slept in shifts, sharing bunks in a practice called hot bunking, where one sailor would rise from a mattress still warm from the previous occupant. And yet, despite these conditions, or perhaps because of them, American submarine crews developed a professionalism and effectiveness that surprised even their own Navy's leadership. The key technological advantage that American submarines possessed had nothing to do with speed. It was the torpedo data computer, a mechanical analog computer that could calculate firing solutions automatically, taking into account the submarine's course and speed, the target's course and speed, torpedo speed, and the deflection angle required to ensure a hit. German submarines used manual calculation methods that required the commander to estimate these variables in his head or use a simplified slide rule device. The torpedo data computer, by contrast, continuously updated the firing solution as new periscope observations were fed into it, allowing for far more accurate shooting, especially against maneuvering targets. Combined with SJ surface search radar, which American submarines began receiving in 1942 and which could detect surface targets in complete darkness or fog, the Gato-class boats became almost impossible to evade. A Japanese merchant captain, steaming through what he believed was an empty ocean on a moonless night, would have no warning before torpedoes struck his hull. The first indication of danger would be the explosion. By the summer of 1944, the statistical reality of American submarine success could no longer be ignored, even in Berlin. Japanese oil imports from the Dutch East Indies had fallen from 4 million barrels per month in 1943 to under 2 million barrels per month in 1944. By 1945, that figure would drop below 100,000 barrels per month. The Japanese war machine, utterly dependent on imported oil, was starving. Aircraft couldn't fly without fuel. Warships remained in port because there was no oil for their boilers. Training for pilots was curtailed because aviation gasoline no longer existed in sufficient quantities. The factories producing Zero fighters and Betty bombers slowed and then stopped as raw materials from Southeast Asia failed to arrive. This was the strategic consequence of submarine warfare conducted by those slow, ungainly Gato-class boats. They had done to Japan what German U-boats had failed to do to Britain. They had severed the lifeline between the home islands and the resources required to continue the war. The German naval attaché in Tokyo, Konter-Admiral Paul Wenneker, began filing increasingly alarmed reports in the autumn of 1944. His dispatches described a situation that seemed almost impossible to German strategic thinking. Japanese shipping was being systematically destroyed, not by overwhelming numbers of attackers, but by a relatively small force of submarines operating with devastating efficiency. Wenneker had access to Japanese naval statistics, and what he saw disturbed him. In September of 1944 alone, American submarines sank over 150,000 tons of Japanese merchant shipping. In October, the figure exceeded 170,000 tons. These were losses that Japan, with its limited shipbuilding capacity, could not replace. Japanese shipyards in 1944 were producing approximately 300,000 tons of new merchant shipping per year. American submarines were sinking over 2 million tons per year. The mathematics were brutal and irreversible. What made these losses particularly devastating was their nature. The Germans, in their Atlantic campaign, had primarily targeted cargo ships carrying military supplies, tanks, aircraft, ammunition, food for British forces. These were grievous losses, but Britain was a developed industrial nation with domestic agriculture and manufacturing capacity. It could absorb the losses and adapt. Japan was different. Japan was an island empire entirely dependent on imported raw materials for its industrial base. The merchant ships being sunk by American submarines weren't just carrying military cargo. They were carrying the basic inputs required for Japanese society to function: rice from Southeast Asia to feed the civilian population, iron ore from Manchuria and the Philippines to feed the steel mills, bauxite for aluminum production, rubber for vehicle tires, tin, copper, zinc. When these ships failed to arrive, the effects cascaded through the entire economy. Factory production declined not because of bombing, but because the raw materials never reached the factory gates. Civilians began to starve not because of food shortages on the farms, but because the rice harvest in French Indochina and Thailand couldn't be transported to the home islands. Lieutenant Commander Samuel Dealey's USS Harder exemplified the killing efficiency of these operations. Between February and August of 1944, across 5 war patrols, Dealey and his crew sank 16 Japanese vessels, but the raw numbers didn't capture the full impact. Of those 16 vessels, 5 were destroyers, the very ships tasked with protecting convoys from submarine attack. Dealey had developed a specific tactic for engaging destroyers. Rather than evading them, he would deliberately attract their attention, allowing them to close for a depth charge attack. Then, at the last moment, as the destroyer charged toward him at high speed, he would fire a spread of torpedoes down the throat, hitting the destroyer head-on before it could react. The first time he executed this maneuver, in April of 1944 off the coast of WWII atoll, his crew thought he had lost his mind. The destroyer was charging directly at them at over 30 knots, closing the range with every second. In the conning tower, men gripped whatever handhold they could find, waiting for the depth charges they were certain would tear the harder apart. Dealey remained at the periscope, watching the destroyer's bow wave grow larger, calculating range, and bearing with mechanical precision. At 800 yards, he ordered fire. 3 torpedoes leapt from the forward tubes. 45 seconds later, the destroyer Ikazuchi erupted in a massive explosion, its bow lifting out of the water before the entire vessel broke apart and sank in less than 3 minutes. Over the next 4 months, Dealey repeated this tactic 4 more times, sinking the destroyers Minatsuki, Hayanami, Tanikaze, and Asashimo. Each sinking removed an escort vessel from the Japanese fleet, making every subsequent convoy more vulnerable. By August of 1944, Japanese naval planners were facing a crisis. They were losing destroyers faster than they could build them, and without destroyers, convoys couldn't be protected. Without protected convoys, merchant ships were defenseless. The cycle was accelerating toward total collapse. Dealey's success was not unique. Lieutenant Commander Dudley Morton, commanding USS Wahoo, sank 20 ships across 5 patrols in 1943 before his boat was lost with all hands in October of that year in the La Perouse Strait. Morton's executive officer, Richard O'Kane, would later receive command of USS Tang and become the most successful American submarine commander of the war, sinking 24 Japanese ships before Tang was sunk by one of its own malfunctioning torpedoes in October of 1944. Commander Eugene Fluckey, commanding USS Barb, pioneered the use of rockets fired from submarine deck mounts, and his crew conducted the only ground invasion of the Japanese home islands by American forces when they went ashore on Karafuto and destroyed a coastal railroad. Commander Slade Cutter, in USS Seahorse, sank 19 ships. Commander Royce Grossman, in USS Flasher, accounted for over 100,000 tons of enemy shipping sunk, making Flasher the highest-scoring American submarine by tonnage. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. These men and their crews operated under conditions that would have been unthinkable to surface fleet sailors. A typical war patrol lasted 60 days. For 60 days, 80 men lived in a steel tube 300 feet long and 27 feet in diameter. They breathed recycled air that grew increasingly foul as the atmospheric scrubbers labored to remove carbon dioxide. They shared 54 bunks through hot bunking arrangements. They endured temperatures that could exceed 110 degrees Fahrenheit in the engine rooms. They faced death not just from enemy action, but from equipment failure, accidental flooding, collision, or simple mechanical breakdown thousands of miles from any friendly port. 52 American submarines were lost during World War II, taking over 3,700 officers and men with them. That represented a casualty rate of approximately 22%, the highest of any branch of the American military. Every man who volunteered for submarine duty knew these statistics. They volunteered anyway. The psychological profile of a successful submarine commander was distinctive. These were not men who sought glory or public recognition. They were meticulous, patient, and capable of enduring enormous stress without visible reaction. They had to be comfortable with isolation, with making life and death decisions without consultation, and with accepting responsibility for the lives of every man aboard. Many were poor fits for the peacetime Navy's bureaucratic culture. Some, like Dudley Morton, were considered too aggressive and unconventional for promotion in normal circumstances. The war gave them submarines and set them loose, and they discovered that they were perfectly suited for this particular kind of warfare. The tactical execution of a successful torpedo attack required near-perfect coordination between the commander at the periscope, the executive officer managing the torpedo data computer, the diving officer maintaining precise depth control, and the torpedo room crews preparing weapons for firing. A single error at any point in this chain could result in a miss, or worse, in the submarine's position being revealed to an alert escort that would hunt it mercilessly. Consider the attack profile that USS Tang executed against a Japanese convoy on the night of October 23, 1944, in the Formosa Strait. Commander Richard O'Kane had detected the convoy using surface radar at 22,000 yards, approximately 11 miles. It was well after midnight, completely dark, with a calm sea. The convoy consisted of approximately 9 merchant ships with multiple escort vessels. O'Kane positioned Tang ahead of the convoy's track and waited, running on the surface to maintain battery charge. As the convoy approached, he identified the 3 largest targets, a tanker and 2 large cargo vessels. The attack plan was to fire all 6 forward tubes at these 3 targets in rapid succession, then swing the boat around and fire the 4 stern tubes at targets of opportunity. The entire attack would take less than 10 minutes. At 1,000 yards range, Tang fired the first 6 torpedoes. O'Kane didn't wait to observe the results. He immediately ordered full right rudder, swinging the stern toward the convoy to unmask the stern tubes. The first explosion came 20 seconds later, then another, then 3 more in rapid succession. 5 hits out of 6 torpedoes. 2 ships were sinking. A third was dead in the water, burning. The convoy scattered, escorts racing toward Tang's position. O'Kane steadied on a new course, selected 2 more targets, and fired 3 stern torpedoes. All 3 hit. Another ship began sinking. Tang now had 1 torpedo remaining in a stern tube. O'Kane selected the final target, a large transport, and fired. The torpedo ran straight and true for 30 seconds, then suddenly curved hard left, broached the surface, and began running in a circle. It was a circular run, a malfunction where the torpedo's gyroscope or steering mechanism failed, causing it to turn back toward its launching platform. O'Kane ordered emergency speed, trying to outrun his own weapon. The torpedo closed the distance, struck Tang in the stern, and exploded. The blast destroyed the aft torpedo room and flooded the engine rooms instantly. Tang sank in less than 1 minute. Of the 87 men aboard, only 9 survived, including O'Kane, who was blown clear of the bridge by the explosion. They were picked up by a Japanese destroyer and spent the remainder of the war as prisoners. But in that single night attack, Tang had sunk 7 Japanese ships, totaling over 35,000 tons. This kind of carnage was not exceptional. It was routine. In November of 1944, a Wolfpack consisting of USS Redfish, Razorback, and Batfish intercepted a convoy carrying Japanese troops and equipment being evacuated from the Philippines. In a coordinated attack lasting 3 days, the 3 submarines sank 8 ships, including a large transport carrying over 4,000 Japanese soldiers. Fewer than 300 survived. These losses weren't just statistics to be recorded in after-action reports. They represented the systematic dismantling of Japan's ability to project military power across its empire. Troops couldn't be reinforced because the transports never arrived. Aircraft couldn't be delivered because the cargo ships were sunk. Fuel for the combined fleet remained in storage tanks in Borneo because the tankers were on the bottom of the South China Sea. By early 1945, the situation had become catastrophic. Japanese naval planners estimated that they needed at least 3 million tons of merchant shipping to maintain minimum supply lines between the home islands and the remaining territories under Japanese control. They had less than 2 million tons remaining, and that number was declining by 10% every month. In desperation, Japanese authorities implemented increasingly extreme measures. Merchant ships were ordered to sail only at night, staying close to shore where they might benefit from land-based air cover. This merely slowed the rate of loss, it didn't stop it. American submarines, equipped with radar and functioning torpedoes, could attack with impunity in darkness. Shipyards were ordered to focus exclusively on building escort vessels rather than new merchant ships, but escort vessels couldn't protect convoys that no longer existed. The civilian population was mobilized to construct wooden boats to carry cargo in coastal waters, but these vessels were too small and too slow to address the fundamental problem. There was no way to move bulk cargo from Southeast Asia to Japan without large, ocean-going merchant ships, and those ships were being destroyed faster than they could be replaced. The strategic impact became visible in the most basic metrics of Japanese society. Rice imports dropped from over 2 million metric tons in 1943 to under 700,000 metric tons in 1945. The civilian rice ration in Tokyo, which had been 330 grams per person per day in 1941, fell to 150 grams per person per day by the summer of 1945. Industrial production across every sector contracted. Steel production in 1945 was 46% of the 1944 level. Aircraft production fell by 60%. Munitions production collapsed. The Japanese military, which had begun the war as a fearsome, well-equipped force, was by 1945 reduced to training pilots who would never have enough fuel to fly combat missions, manning guns that had no ammunition, and planning defensive operations with troops who had no food. German observers, watching this catastrophe unfold, struggled to reconcile it with their understanding of submarine warfare. The Japanese merchant marine had been larger than Britain's. Japan had more escort vessels than Britain had possessed in 1940. The distances involved in the Pacific were greater than in the Atlantic, which should have made submarine operations more difficult, not easier. And yet the Americans, with their slow, technologically unimpressive Gato-class submarines, had achieved what the entire U-boat fleet, at its peak strength of over 400 boats, had failed to accomplish. They had decisively severed an island nation's maritime supply lines. Kapitän Zur. See Hans-Jürgen Reinicke, a U-boat commander who had sunk over 100,000 tons of Allied shipping in the Atlantic before being assigned to Tokyo as a technical liaison in late 1944, wrote a remarkably candid assessment in January of 1945. He acknowledged that German submarine doctrine, focused on speed and technological sophistication, had missed a fundamental principle. In submarine warfare, presence in the target area mattered more than maximum speed. A submarine that could remain on patrol for 60 days was more effective than a submarine that could sprint at high speed but had to return to base after 30 days because it had exhausted its fuel or provisions. The Gato-class, with its enormous fuel capacity and extensive provision storage, could patrol for twice as long as a German Type 7 U-boat. This meant that, on average, American submarines spent more time in contact with the enemy and less time in transit. Reinicke calculated that a Gato-class submarine, despite its lower speed, achieved approximately 30% more time on station per month than a comparable German boat. Over the course of a year, this translated to roughly 3 additional war patrols worth of patrol time. He concluded his report with a statement that must have been difficult for a German officer to write. The Americans had, through accident or insight, designed a superior submarine for this theatre of operations. His report was filed, read, and largely ignored. By January of 1945, Germany itself was on the verge of collapse, and the effectiveness of American submarines against Japan was increasingly irrelevant to German strategic concerns. But the historical irony remained. The submarine force that German naval experts had dismissed as slow and obsolete had waged the most successful submarine campaign in naval history. By the time Japan surrendered in August of 1945, American submarines had sunk approximately 1,300 Japanese merchant vessels, totaling over 5 million tons of shipping. They had also sunk 1 battleship, 8 aircraft carriers, 15 cruisers, and 42 destroyers from the Japanese Navy. These numbers represented roughly 55% of all Japanese merchant ships lost during the war, and approximately 30% of Japanese naval combatants sunk. No other single weapon system, not the carrier raids, not the B-29 strategic bombing campaign, not the island-hopping amphibious assaults, had inflicted comparable strategic damage. The cost had been high. 52 submarines lost, 3,700 men dead. But measured in terms of strategic effect per casualty, the submarine force had been extraordinarily effective. Each submariner who died had contributed, on average, to the destruction of over 1,300 tons of enemy shipping. No other military branch could claim comparable efficiency. The immediate post-war period saw a rush to document and analyze this success. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, in its assessment of the Pacific War, concluded that, quote, "The war against shipping was the most important single factor in the collapse of the Japanese economy. Submarine operations were identified as the primary instrument of that campaign." Japanese officials, interviewed after the surrender, confirmed that the loss of merchant shipping had crippled their ability to continue the war. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, one of the architects of the kamikaze program, stated in his interrogation that by mid-1945, Japan was unable to train kamikaze pilots effectively because there was insufficient aviation fuel for training flights. The planes existed, the volunteers existed, but the tankers that would have carried fuel from the Dutch East Indies to Japan were at the bottom of the ocean, sunk by American submarines. Captain Atsushi Oi, a senior logistics officer in the Imperial Japanese Navy, provided even more damning testimony. He stated that Japan's decision to expand into Southeast Asia in 1941 had been predicated on the assumption that the raw materials captured there, particularly oil, rubber, and rice, could be transported back to Japan in sufficient quantities to sustain the war effort. This assumption, he acknowledged, had been completely invalidated by American submarine operations. By early 1945, the flow of resources from Southeast Asia had been reduced to a trickle, rendering meaningless the entire strategic justification for the war. The Gato-class submarines themselves, those boats that had been the instruments of this strategic victory, had varied fates. Some were decommissioned immediately after the war and scrapped. Others were maintained in active service, patrolling during the early Cold War. A few were converted to other uses, as training vessels, as experimental platforms for new technologies, or as target ships for weapons testing. USS Kavala, which had sunk the Japanese aircraft carrier Shokaku, was preserved as a museum ship in Galveston, Texas. USS Cod, which had conducted 7 war patrols and rescued Dutch sailors from a sunken submarine in 1945, was preserved as a museum in Cleveland, Ohio. These preserved boats allow visitors to experience, in a small way, the claustrophobic conditions under which submarine crews operated. Walking through the narrow passages, seeing the cramped bunks and the maze of pipes and valves, one gains some appreciation for the physical and psychological demands placed on the men who served in these vessels. The legacy of the American submarine campaign extended far beyond the immediate post-war period. It fundamentally shaped naval doctrine for the Cold War and beyond. The concept of using submarines not primarily to attack enemy warships, but to interdict merchant shipping and sever supply lines, became a cornerstone of Soviet naval planning. The United States Navy, recognizing the strategic value demonstrated in the Pacific, invested heavily in submarine technology, leading eventually to the nuclear-powered submarines that would patrol the oceans during the Cold War. The lessons learned about torpedo technology, fire control systems, and crew training informed submarine operations for decades. But perhaps the most important legacy was the validation of a principle that German naval theorists had failed to grasp. In maritime warfare, the perfect is often the enemy of the 30. Good The Germans had designed submarines that were technologically sophisticated, fast, and capable of diving deep. These were excellent submarines for the Atlantic theatre, but they had optimized for the wrong variables. The Americans, working with less experience and less theoretical sophistication, had designed submarines that were reliable, long-ranged, and comfortable enough to allow crews to remain effective over extended patrols. These characteristics, which seemed pedestrian compared to German performance metrics, proved decisive in the Pacific. The commanders who had led this campaign, men like Dealey, Morton, O'Kane, Fluckey, and dozens of others, were celebrated after the war. Many received the Medal of Honor. Streets were named after them. Submarines were named after them. But they themselves often expressed ambivalence about their wartime experiences. Richard O'Kane, interviewed decades after the war, described submarine warfare as, quote, "the most challenging and rewarding service I could have imagined," but also acknowledged the psychological toll of sending ships to the bottom, knowing that hundreds of men were dying with each sinking. Eugene Fluckey, in his memoirs, described the strange mixture of professional pride and moral discomfort that came from being so effective at destruction. These were not men who gloried in killing. They were professionals who had been given a task and had executed it with devastating efficiency. The moral weight of that efficiency stayed with them for the rest of their lives. For the families of the 3,700 submariners who never came home, there was no closure, no grave to visit. Submarines that were lost typically went down with all hands, leaving no survivors and no remains to recover. The families received telegrams stating that their sons or husbands were, quote, "missing in action and presumed lost," but the specifics of how and where they died remained unknown. Some boats, like USS Wahoo, were later located by deep-sea exploration, providing some measure of resolution decades after the war. Others remain undiscovered, their final resting places known only approximately from the last position reports they transmitted before disappearing. The Japanese merchant sailors who died in these attacks are largely forgotten. No memorials commemorate them, no museums preserve their stories. They were, in the brutal arithmetic of total war, collateral damage, men whose deaths were necessary to achieve strategic objectives they had no control over. Many were not even Japanese. They were Korean forced laborers, Chinese contract workers, or Southeast Asian civilians pressed into service. They died in explosions, in fires, or by drowning in darkness as ships broke apart and sank. Their names were recorded in ship manifests that went down with the vessels, and their families often never learned what happened to them. This was the human cost of the submarine campaign, a cost that statistics about tonnage sunk and strategic effect achieved cannot capture. Looking back across 8 decades, the story of the Gato-class submarines and their campaign against Japanese shipping reveals a pattern that appears repeatedly in military history. Technological superiority does not guarantee strategic success. What matters is fitness for purpose, the alignment between the capabilities of a weapon system and the demands of the specific operational environment in which it will be employed. The Germans designed superior submarines by almost every measurable technical standard. They were faster, could dive deeper, and incorporated more advanced engineering, but they were designed for the wrong war. The Americans designed submarines that were, by comparison, crude and unimpressive. But those submarines were exactly what the Pacific theatre required: long-ranged, reliable, and capable of sustained operations in the vast emptiness of the world's largest ocean. That difference, more than any other factor, determined the outcome of the submarine war in the Pacific. The mockery that German admirals had directed toward the Gato-class in 1942, the confident assessments that dismissed American submarine technology as obsolete, had been proven catastrophically wrong, not because German analysis was incompetent, but because they had asked the wrong questions. They had measured speed when they should have measured range. They had optimized for pursuit when they should have optimized for patience. and by the time the implications became clear, it was far too late to matter. Japan's merchant marine was destroyed, its economy was in collapse, and the war was effectively over. The slow, ungainly Gato-class submarines had done their work. Thank you for reading. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.